This is Gail Morgan welcoming you to the Libertarian Counterpoint. Now, your host, James Just.
And thank you for joining us. With me today is Richard Fields and John Cameron. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, we'll jump right in. The GOP believes the Democrats are giving them a winning strategy for 2022. I'm not entirely sure what they're thinking of because they don't have a strategy for 2022, it appears. Just not being Democrats doesn't seem to be a winning strategy for me. But what do you guys think about this?
Well, not being a Democrat might be enough. Of course, they're politicizing it and taking the wrong side of some of the issues, and just saying we aren't Democrats, namely immigration, and Republicans going after being border wall and nativist and all of that. It might help them in the short run in 2022, but in the long run, we're already a minority state here in California and the country, regardless of what kind of draconian immigration controls take place. We're going to turn into a majority country in not too long a time. And if the Republicans are the people who oppose immigration and in essence oppose minorities having a voice in government, is going to come back and bite them over the long run. But in the short run, hey, it's a popular issue among the rednecks. As far as infrastructure, the infrastructure bill, and I say so-called infrastructure bill because 80-90% of it is just Democratic wish list stuff like long-term care for long-term care workers, funding, climate change, boondoggles, family care, all of that kind of stuff. Those are things that the Republicans are not in favor of, and that the Democrats are. And if that's rammed through in the 2 years that Democrats have a slim majority, that will come back to bite them.
Well, I beg to differ with Richard on a couple of points and I didn't drill down on the polls, but prior to the last election, some people said, well, after the last election, when even though the total number was still small, the percentage increase in black males voting for Trump was pretty significant, even though the sample size is probably, it's still a rather insignificant slice. And people who talked to folks and asked them why, as a black person, why would you vote for this racist Trump, said, basically all those illegals coming over the border are taking jobs that young black men could have. So there's a strange amount of support from a part of the demographic that's typically voted like 90% Democrat, and so that's kind of counterbalances the and I agree it's wrong, the strategy of closed borders and fear and all the rest of that, but basically it found eager ears supposedly in I thought there was only going to be 3 guests on the show, found eager ears in black males, but I don't know if those numbers are right, and it was out of the popular media, and I think those people just sit around smoking dope and make stuff up. Whereas when I sit around smoking dope, I try to drill down into the truth. Just kidding, folks. So I think that's part of it. Richard, you brought up something on one of the other shows that Biden's popular because he gave money away, and it looks like the information that I read in some of the research I did says his popularity is pretty strong. But then again, it'd be really hard for us to get good numbers out of lamestream press because it's like 95% supportive of whatever that section of the political class is doing, the socialist party. So they just all over this stuff.
We're looking at a 59% approval rating for Biden by the Pew Research. Now, without question, Pew is left of center and is going to structure their survey in such a way that it would be favorable to Democrats and Biden in particular. But 59% is pretty stout this early in the administration. And I attribute most of that to the fact that people like free money and figure that there's an endless supply of it, mistakenly, of course. But it's in the short run, it's a winning position to give money away. Long run, it's disastrous. Short run, hey, I like it.
Well, and also in the short run, we have to remember that we no longer have Trump to kick around, and so I think there's a certain segment of the population that's simply happy we don't have to hear Trump's name all the dang time. And I think they're certainly happy that Biden's there because they don't have to hear Trump, and that makes a certain amount of people happy. Policy doesn't matter for a lot of people. It's their emotions, and as long as that emotion isn't being fed, they're going to be happy.
But yeah, the Republican, bringing up Trump, the Republicans have another problem, which is a significant percentage of Republicans can't stand Trump for good reason, and another significant percentage of Republicans can't stand anybody that doesn't like Trump. And the Republican war has got a simmering civil war going on within it as to whether or not to be accepting and supportive of Trump talking points and Trump as a personality going forward in the party.
Yeah, as soon as someone's reasonable can actually get that Trump support is really just an anti-establishment, populist Republican perspective, and they can feed that, they can get past this Trump thing. But I don't know if there's anybody on the Republican side who's willing to actually do that.
Well, I think and also I think in order to, because there's a lot of people out there that are anti-Trump enough to go with Biden. I mean, not in the Republican Party, very many in the Republican Party as well, because I work for a nonprofit and that was conservative/libertarian. And, a ton of those people didn't give any money at all to Trump. But after he was elected, they got behind the fact that he wasn't a socialist. So, they changed allegiance. I think in order to capture what you call the middle, or people who would, adopt maybe some Tea Party kind of ideas, you got to get rid of Trump, because he's not actually really a classical Republican, and which is, he is in one respect strong military, but as far as fiscal responsibility goes, he's a nut. And, protectionism, trade, deficit spending, all the rest of that. If you want to capture people out there all over the political spectrum that, kind of want us to have a balanced budget and not, explode our economy and have fiat currency and all the rest of that. And I think there are a lot of them out there. Then, the Trump core isn't going to be where those people go to. And as long as Trump's there, people who would maybe align with Goldwater type Republicans aren't going to align, even if they're not in the party.
Well, and of course, the wild card is Justin Amash. Justin Amash made a token effort to win the Libertarian Party nomination in 2016, pulled out when it looked like the hardcore Libertarians weren't going to buy into his late arrival in the state caucusing. But he's being very active on social media, being very active, going to Libertarian Party conventions and events and so forth. So he, I think, is at least now positioning himself for 2024, whatever the next presidential election, 2024, run for president as a Libertarian. And that could really toss a hand grenade into the idea of Republicans being able to take control versus Democrats being able to take control in 2024. 2022 does look fairly decent for Republicans, simply based on the fact that the party that wins the presidential election almost always loses seats in the following two-year congressional election. And the margins are razor thin as it is.
Yeah. Well, so we're going to move on, but this actually brings up, John Stamash brings up an interesting question. There was an article out from an economics professor out of Caracas discussing, this is out of Caracas, discussing the cancer of totalitarian censorship in the United States, of all places. But his point was that, there's a couple of ways to get to this totalitarian perspective, and one is kind of the Soviet Union, Venezuela way, and the other way is this self-censorship, cancel culture that the United States is headed down. And the fact that someone from Caracas is pointing this out, I think, is humorous, to say the least.
Well, yeah, it is humorous, and it's interesting. Censorship in the Soviet style, the hardcore communist style, is government censorship, pure and simple. It's the government saying what you can and cannot say, what can be broadcast, what can't, what can see a printer's ink, and what cannot. But censorship, fascist style, is something entirely different. That's where the government and large corporations collude to decide what can and cannot be said. And that's kind of where we're going in the United States. We have a very unhealthy relationship between the major social media platforms, the people who who are gatekeepers for the internet, and the government. And the reason for that unhealthy relationship is most of those companies are being overtly, if not covertly, threatened by the federal government for higher, more onerous regulation if they don't comply with whatever the government wants them to say. And so they're complying. They're coming down, large corporations are coming down against the voting law change in Georgia. And if you take a real close look at the voting law change in Georgia, it's not all that onerous. It's being portrayed as racist and, the worst thing since Hades, the devil escaped Hades, but it's in fact relatively benign. But the corporate media is behind it. And so we have a fascist relationship, really, between media, particularly social media, not to mention mainstream media, and the government.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the lamestream media because I think, an awful lot of people do get all of their ideas from social media, and they follow social media a lot. But there's still a huge section of the United States of America, which that maybe is a subject for another show. The fact that we are a United States rather than a different form of government, and they get their political bias from the news they watch on television. They get it from the radio they listen to. They get it from late night talk shows and all the rest of that. And if any of you have bothered to look at lamestream media television, much less read lamestream media newspapers, which some people still read, I guess, the bias is huge. The shows have woke mentality and political messaging built into them to the point where they're almost unwatchable, whether it's a drama or a comedy. For the most part, there are some standouts. So the message that's out there from all media, other than some rare exceptions, and I would say, Richard, you're fortunate enough to live in an area where there's one exception, it's massive, it's obvious, it's in lockstep. I remember after the what do they call it now? The insurrection on January 6th, where nobody died from violence, and there was
one or two did, but yeah.
Well, not from violent activity. There were all medical. The people died from medical causes, and they've basically are not releasing the one cop that died. They're not releasing any of the results from the coroner's report because it will show he didn't die from violence. But anyway, but within minutes of that happening, the reporting across the spectrum all used the same buzzwords. It was white insurrection, racist, nationalist, white insurrection, da 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 da. And it became the common speak across all media platforms all over the country within seconds. And, I don't think there's any central wizard behind the curtain pulling the levers. I think they're just all in the same mindset, and they all woke, and they realize what woke is, and they adopt it. And it's pervasive. It's everywhere.
Well, they all follow the lead of primarily the New York Times and secondarily the Washington Post. If it's in the New York Times, it's going to be on AP. It's going to be the front page story on the New York Times today. Is also the front page story on most of the newspapers across the country, because that's where they take their cue. Because most newspapers, not to mention TV stations, don't do a whole lot of original reporting. They don't have the staff or the revenue to support hiring their own reporters. They don't have their own Washington bureau anymore. They rely on the New York Times, the Washington Post, AP, and to a lesser extent Reuters to get all of their national or international news, and they do a relatively poor job just even on local reporting. They just don't have the staff to, because newspapers are a dying breed, and local television stations are following quickly, and radio stations as well following quickly in their footsteps.
And that brings up another question. I don't know if you guys listen to radio, like commercial radio, whether it's AM or FM. But I've noticed as I listen to FM stations, I go through the local rock, whether it's alternative or classic rock or whatever stations, that a huge chunk of commercial messaging is being paid for by orgs that are government funded. It's don't park your car on the train tracks. Secondhand smoke will kill you.
It's actually not paid for. That's actually public service announcements for the most part, and the radio stations do it. It's free. They do it gratis.
So that if that's the case, it means they don't have any paid ads, because the just about every spot I'm listening to is that. But I think a lot of the stuff that comes out from the state of California is actually paid for. I could be wrong.
Some is. Terrestrial radio and terrestrial TV, not to mention ink soakers, are dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yes, well, they're dinosaurs because of their own actions. They've actually...
not necessarily. They're dinosaurs because the internet does a heck of a lot better, immediate, more tailored job of presenting news. That's presenting its own problems, but it's, they can't compete with the internet.
Well, they gave up local news at the one time when the one difference between local newspapers and local TV stations, between them and the internet, is the ability to give us local news. They kind of gave it up. It's essentially, they did what Sears did. Sears gave up their catalog right at the time the internet came along, but they didn't move to the internet. They just gave up the catalog. And so the news media is essentially doing the same thing. They've all gone this whole hardcore left, and anybody who's not hardcore left, you don't even have to be right. You just have to be not hardcore left, just turn it off. And so they've got this ever increasing, shrinking, ever decreasing viewer base, and then they're wondering why. It's just, it boggles my mind that they haven't understood that, if they actually told people what happened on the streets, like explain what's going on to the local development, whether the rail yards here in Sacramento or Aggie Square, none of that's covered locally. And if they told us about this, maybe more people would actually watch them and listen to them and buy the newspaper. The newspaper doesn't do me any good, so why would I buy it? It doesn't tell me anything.
To pile on to your point about local news, there are still some small town papers that are doing extraordinarily well. And it's because they focused completely and totally on local news. I mean, they'll have some national news there, but they figure people can get national news somewhere else. They'll, have some sports reporting that, everybody has allegiance to typically the nearest professional baseball, football, and basketball team. In some areas of the country, soccer, but everything else is the PTA meeting with lots of pictures. It's the volunteer organization with lots of pictures. It's the moose, the elks, on and on and on and on. Lots of names, lots of pictures, completely local, and they are making money. I'm not saying they're.
Oh yeah, and the local police beat with with all the arrests
police
for,
report
for minor stuff.
Well,
and those work. And you're absolutely right, James. When newspapers gave up local, and started just downloading wire stories, they lost their hold. But what really killed them was Craigslist, and because the profit in newspapers was all out of classifieds. It looked like it came from the big flashy display ads, but the actual profit, the revenue per page and classified advertising, which was automotive, real estate, and employment, was where the dollars came from, and they dropped right to the bottom line. And when Craigslist pulled all of the local classified advertising out of those newspapers, they went upside down, and they never return. It wasn't Google, it was Craigslist. So,
well, I like to point out the gig economy could have saved them. They could have transferred to gig style reporters, but their union contract simply wouldn't allow it, and they were inflexible. And inflexible corporations, inflexible organizations have a tendency to die out. That's just kind of what they do. Well, speaking of dying out, we're going to move on here in the last few minutes. Riots at the Capitol were bad on January 6th. We all kind of acknowledged that having riots is bad, violence is bad. Except now this last weekend, Maxine Waters apparently was caught telling Black Lives Matter protesters to get more confrontational in their rioting. I'm not entirely sure what message our leaders are trying to send. Is riots bad?
Well, the message they're trying to send is if you're rioting for the right thing, that's fine. That's righteous. If you're rioting for the wrong thing, forget about it.
Since when did violence be bad, not be a universal thing? Committing acts of violence, destroying things.
Violence in favor of the. It's the old saw. Violence in favor of a righteous cause is fine. The ends justify the means. That's the philosophy that's being expressed there. If the ends are right, we don't care about the means. Now, as libertarians, that's anathema to us. The ends don't justify the means. But in popular politics, both left and right, Democrat and Republican, the ends justify the means. That's why Maxine Waters can condone rioting in the streets. It's why Republicans can condone civil asset forfeiture and putting people who try to cross the border to have a better life in cages.
Yeah, this notion that we can have riots one spot and it's fine. I don't even necessarily fine. It's this violence, this notion. I don't even trust myself to make that the choice when it's okay. When does violence become an acceptable use? When does violence become acceptable?
The only time violence is acceptable is in self-defense.
Self-defense.
And very seldom is that the situation. Most times, most forms of violence are offensive, not defensive.
Yeah, I kind of want to drill down a little bit on this whole Maxine Waters thing because inciting to riot is actually a crime, and if you're telling people to get more confrontational, I think should you use the word violence, somebody could have probably filed a suit against her, but get more confrontational has enough leeway in it to where. Maybe it's not inciting to riot.
But isn't that clearer than what Trump said on the 6th? That's more a clear call to violence than what Trump said on the 6th?
Well, it's absolutely a more clear call to violence than what Trump said on the 6th. Trump said, whether he meant it or not, let's keep this peaceful. Just let your opinions be known. We want to make sure this is peaceful because of our brothers in blue, that we respect the law and da. But so I absolutely agree that we have, as Richard accurately pointed out, a double standard here. And the Black Lives Matter organization is disgusting. The idea that Black Lives Matter is a wonderful thing. The blacklivesmatter.org is a socialist mess that promulgates the idea that nuclear families are wrong and just crazy. But the idea that cops shouldn't shoot black people is absolutely necessary to be front page news, and I absolutely agree. But when you anytime you start burning people's property down and killing more people in those riots than were ever shot by a cop, it even people whose IQ is pretty darn low are going to feel some dissonance there, and they're going to lose some support. So I think these people like Maxine Waters, she's way outlived her usefulness if she ever had any in Congress, she's doing way more harm to what's actually a good cause than good, and I wish she'd just shut up.
The sad part of the whole thing is we're turning into a garrison state. We're turning into a country where the police are not guardians but warriors. We're turning into a country where we have barbed wire fence around courthouses in order to protect the supposed enforcers of the law and the judiciary, those who educate the law. We're turning into a place where the Capitol is surrounded by barriers and barbed wire and so forth. We're turning into what looks like a third world dictatorship. And I'm wondering if the looks are accurate of reality.
Well, you actually say that.
I think they are.
Well, you say that. I saw a podcast from a guy from the actual third world, and he said he went to Portland, and he said Portland reminded him of a third world country. Just with all the Antifa activity in the last couple of years, the downtown Portland has started. He says it reminded him of a third world country.
And we have to be careful. We have to be careful not to lay all the blame on Antifa, just like we need to be careful not to lay all the blame on Proud Boys and the insurrectionists on the right. We have to lay the blame where it belongs on people who believe that violence is an acceptable means to achieving their ends, whether their ends are Black Lives Matter or whether their ends are no immigration or whatever their ends are. Violence is not an acceptable form of protest or getting your way. It's the opposite of having a dialogue and a discussion and a negotiation.
Yeah, and I'd also like to point out that the people we should actually be blaming are those politicians and profiteers who feed off of it. The average person, we call them what they call them, the useful idiots. I don't want to be calling necessarily idiots, but they're useful cannon fodder essentially for the political class.
You can't really blame people for being frustrated. We have a country where the Federal Reserve is purposefully making interest rates at zero so that savers cannot get a return on their savings, so that they are facing retirement as paupers. We're looking at a country where it's impossible to make as much money as a percentage of the national income. Now it's way lower. The 90% or the 99% make a lower percentage of the national income now than they did 40 or 50 years ago. And that's also a result of Federal Reserve policy that funnels new money toward the elites, toward the 1%, toward the people who control corporations and banks and so forth. There's a whole lot of frustration that is justified frustration. People just don't realize the cause of the evils that beset us, and those causes are largely government causes, or more precisely, government colluding with business causes.
Well, hopefully that Fed printer ends printing soon, but we are out of time. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and we will see you guys next week.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, James.